Alright, so we've hooked up our front-end website with the backend now using these Firebase libraries and this config down here, and then down here where we say initialize app, that is starting up our connection with the backend. And we also have this constant down here called DB, which is initializing the Firestore connection. So our connection to the database is now stored inside this constant. And now we can go ahead and use this constant to interact with the database. Now the first thing I want to do is actually get all the data from the database. So if we take a look inside our database, we can see we have this recipes collection and these two documents inside. What I'd like to do is retrieve or get this data and ultimately show them inside this list. So to do that, let's go over to our sandbox, and first of all we can say DB to reference our database. That is our database constant. Then we need to get a reference to this collection right here, the recipes collection, because when we reference the database like this, that gets us a reference to the database as a whole. Now there could be multiple different collections inside that database, so we need to specify which collection we want to reach into, and we do that by using a method called collection, like so, and we pass in an argument as a string, which is the collection we want, and that is the recipes collection. So that's what this is called right here. So that is getting us a reference now to this recipes collection. Now once we have that, the next step is to actually retrieve the data inside it, and we do that using a method on this collection called get. And what that does is go out and get all of this data. Now if you think about it, this is going to be an asynchronous task because it's going to take some time to complete, and what this does is return to us a promise. Now if you cast your mind back to when we looked at promises, they allow us to tack on a .then method, and this takes a callback function as an argument, and this function is going to fire when this asynchronous task is complete or when the promise resolves. So right here, this is when we have the data, the response. Now we can also tack on a .catch method, which is going to fire a function if there's some kind of error. Make sure you spell catch correctly, and also we can take in that error as a parameter. What we'll do is just log that to the console, so console.log error. Now let me just tidy this up. First of all, we don't need our parentheses over here, and secondly we also take a snapshot as a response into this function. So this is the data that's returned to us, and what a snapshot is basically a picture of how this collection looks at that moment in time, and it contains different information on it. So if I come down here and say console.log snapshot, and we take a look at that inside the browser, then when we start this is going to make a connection to the recipes collection. It's going to get the documents inside that. Then when we have them, it's going to fire this callback function, and we're logging out the snapshot that we receive back. So let me preview over here, and we can see this snapshot right over here. If I expand that, we have all these different properties with different information about the recipes collection. Now one of those things is this docs thing right here, and that's what we're interested in. We want all the documents inside that collection right here, and they're inside docs. So we have two objects, and each object represents one of those documents. So what I could do is console.log snapshot.docs, and we could see those right here. These are the documents. So it's an array, and we have two elements. Each element is an object, and if you expand one of those, then we can see this different information, but we don't actually see any of the data from that document. We don't actually see the author, the created at, or the title anywhere. So how do we access that from each document? Well, if we expand this proto property, we can see that we have this function called data. So we have to actually call this function data on the doc object to get the data for that document. So I could access one of these, for example, by saying 0, that gets us the first document in the array, then use the data method, and that would get us the data from this first document. So if I save it, now we can see we have this data object. We have the author, the created at, and the title. So then that's how we get data from a single document, but what we'd like to do is cycle through the documents, the docs, and get the data from each one. So let me delete that, and instead what I'm going to do is say snapshot.docs, which is an array of documents, then use for each on those. And inside this for each, let me just spell that correctly, we can fire a function for each of those documents. So I'll refer to each document as a single doc, and then I'm going to console.log the doc.data to see the data on each document. So let me save this and preview, and now we can see both of these documents inside our collection. So now we have both of these documents. What we could do is create a little HTML template for each one of them and output them to the DOM, the browser. So let's create, first of all, a function to do that for us. Now, before we create this function, I need to get a reference to this list over here because that's where we're going to output them. And that list is up here, just this UL. So all I need to do is say const list is equal to document.query selector and grab the UL. So now we have a reference to that UL. The next thing I'm going to do is create a function which is going to create some kind of HTML snippet for each recipe. And we'll call this function for each one of these documents that we get. So let's call this function add recipe and set it equal to an arrow function. We take in the recipe as a parameter. And inside this function, what I'm going to do is, first of all, say let HTML equal to a template string. Now this is where our little template is going to go for each recipe. Now if we look at each recipe, then over here it has an author, a title and a created at. So let's just output the title, this thing, for each individual recipe right here. So to do that for each recipe we need an li tag. So we'll create an li tag first of all, like so. And we're going to output inside this li tag a couple of things ultimately. We're going to output the title, but then we're also going to output the created at some point. So let's do a div for the title. We'll say div, and then we're going to output a variable, so dollar curly braces, and we want the recipe, and it's going to be a dot title property. And it's dot title because this is the thing we're going to be passing through as an argument. So that is the recipe, and on the data it has a dot title property. So now what I'm going to do is actually just console.log the HTML. So now I want to call this function from down here when we cycle through the docs. So for each document we want to call this function and pass in the data from that document as the recipe. So let me do that. I'm going to delete this and then I'm going to say add recipe and pass in the doc.data. So we're doing this for each document that we get back. Save it and refresh, and we can see now we have this little HTML template for each one of these things. We need to close off that div up here. Okay, save that and preview, and now we can see this. So the next step now is to take the inner HTML of this li and set it equal to whatever we have right here. So I'm going to say down here, instead of logging this to the console, get the list, which we got a reference to up here, that's the UL. Then we want the inner HTML, and we just want to append to it. We don't want to completely overwrite it. We want to add to it. So we say plus equals, and we plus equals the HTML that we just created right here. So we're doing this for every document we get back, and we're appending to the HTML for each one. So if we save this, then we can see now we get those two things right here. So we have those, but we don't need these anymore, the top two. So let's delete those from the HTML like that, and just keep it simple, so we have just the ones from the database. Okay, now I also want to output the time, the created at property. And if we look at that, in fact I need to log this to the console again, so I'm going to say console.log doc.data and save that. If we look at this in the console, we can see we have this created at property, and this is a Firebase timestamp object. Now we don't want to output the seconds and the nanoseconds, that makes no sense. Instead we want to output some kind of date, and on this object, on this timestamp object, we have this proto property, and in here we have this toDate property, so I can convert this to an actual date and output that instead. So in here, let me first of all console.log the recipe dot created at, like so. Save that, and we can see now we have this timestamp for each one. Now the next thing I want to do is use the method called toDate that we saw we had access to on each one of those, and save that. And now for each one of these we have this date string instead. So let's now output this, even though it's a bit long, over here as well. So what I'm going to do is create now another div down here and close that div off, and instead of outputting all of this thing down here, I'm going to just store this in a local variable. So I'll say let time equal to this thing, and then I can just output time down here in the template. So time like so. Save that and preview, and now we can see we have the actual title and this gigantic string of the date. Cool. So now we're getting data from the database from this collection using the get method. This returns a promise. When it resolves, it fires the then method and the callback function inside that. Let me just remove the parentheses because we don't need those. And inside this function, we're taking all of the docs on that snapshot we get back. For each one of those, we're firing a callback function. We're taking that individual document and we're logging it to the console to begin with. We don't need that anymore, so let me delete it. Then we're also passing the data from each document into the add recipe function. When we call that for each recipe, we're getting the date from that recipe. Also, we're creating this HTML template, outputting these variables right here from the recipe. Then we're appending that to the inner HTML of the list, which is the UL. So I hope that all makes sense, and now we're successfully outputting those to the browser. So now we've seen how to get documents from the database. In the next video, I want to show you how we can add new documents to the database as well.